Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, I'm going back to the Breaking in the Habit channel to check in with Father Casey. In this video, he is responding to atheist commenters, which has always gone swimmingly for apologists in the past. They always just choose the strongest versions of the atheist arguments to respond to when that happens. So let's see if the atheist commenters that the apologist chooses to represent atheism have gotten any better with Father Casey.
You have to be religious to live a good life.
No. I'd actually argue that it's easier to live a good life if you're not religious, because if you avoid giving to religiously based charities, you're less likely to be funding corruption just right out of the gate, because religious charities are usually protected from any sort of scrutiny just because they are religious. Now, sure, secular charities aren't perfect, but you are way less likely to find the director of a secular charity living in a mansion, flying in a private jet, or sitting on a throne of gold. Okay, the Pope's throne isn't actually made of gold, but the Catholic Church worldwide has at least $73 billion in assets, but that number is hard to pin down because of how secretive they are about their finances, which allows them to beg for money, all while claiming poverty and that the money you give them will go to good works. So yeah, just by virtue of the fact that I give to better charities, it's easier for me to lead a good life than someone who is devoutly religious and gives their money to a church or religious charity. Of course, there are way more metrics that can be used to determine if someone is leading a good life than which charities they give money to, but it is worth reminding people that giving money to the Catholic Church is, at best, wasteful, and at worst, well, you know, it's the Catholic Church.
No, not at all. Christianity believes in something called natural theology, that truth, beauty, and goodness can be found all around us in nature, speaking to us and guiding our consciences.
And since the stuff we see in nature speaks to us and guides our consciences, that means you're definitely not anti-gay rights, right? You know, since hundreds of mammalian species have been observed engaging in homosexual behavior. Also, evolutionarily speaking, much has been made of the question of how homosexuality evolved, but that treats heterosexuality as the ancestrally derived baseline trait. At the origin of sexual reproduction, what is most likely to have occurred was indiscriminate sexual behavior. The little single-celled algae type guys would just mate with anything that was around, and sometimes it would work. So if we're getting our morals from nature, looks like pansexual is the way to go. Why would I do that? But I mean, that's also treating sexual orientation as though it's a moral question, when really it's not. The people who are anti-anything that's not heterosexuality just like to pretend that it is so they can justify their bigotry. And of course, as we learned from a previous video, Father Casey is anti-LGBTQ. So not only is this argument just flat out an appeal to nature fallacy, it's also entirely inconsistent with his actual behavior.
There's something inherent in our world that tells us that murder is bad and generosity is good.
Is there? Because you'd think if that was just inherent to the world we live in, then there wouldn't be murder and everyone would be generous. But that doesn't appear to match up with reality.
You don't need the church for that.
I agree. You don't need the church to be moral. As has been said by people that are way smarter than myself, with or without religion, good people can behave well and bad people can do evil. But for good people to do evil, that takes religion. Steven Weinberg was the smarter person than myself in this instance.
How can you trust a book written thousands of years ago and filled with contradictions?
Well, it depends what you're trusting it for. As a window into some of the various cultures in the ancient Near East, it can be very helpful. As an instruction manual for life, at best you're going to find a few platitudes that are not and never were unique to Christianity, but at worst you end up with things like the 30 Years' War and the Crusade.
I think a lot of people's problems with the Bible could be solved with a slightly different approach. Rather than viewing it as the dictated word of God that fell down from heaven, which it most certainly isn't, what if we read it as a collection of what God's people have said about God over time?
That certainly is a better, more nuanced way to look at it than the fundamentalists that I usually respond to, but it comes with problems as well. Well, at least if you still want to believe in the God portrayed in the Bible, that is, because as it turns out, the things that these people wrote about God were frequently mutually exclusive, like how one verse will say God is love, and other verses describe God as hating things, like Jacob's brother Esau. Sure, you could say that the thing about God's fallible people writing their understanding of God over time makes this contradiction irrelevant, because, you know, clearly one of those people was just wrong about their understanding of God, but if you're gonna go that route, then why do we have have any reverence for the Bible at all. There are literally thousands of denominations of Christianity that all have mutually exclusive views of God, and you're telling me that I can't even use the book that is commonly called the Word of God to figure out which of those views is correct because the book itself can't be trusted to give a coherent picture of God? That seems like a problem that an actual God would be able to solve easily, but him turning up to clarify his nature just doesn't seem to be something he's willing to do, making it look rather like he doesn't exist, or that if he does, he doesn't care what you believe about him.
Inspired by real events and guided by a living and true God, so containing truth beyond human reason, but undeniably human in composition.
God damn my proclivity for cutting in early. Okay, can you give me an example of this truth that it contains that is beyond human reason? I mean, aside from the obvious things like, it's not reasonable to expect sprinkling dead bird blood to somehow cleanse you thing, because if we're just talking about things that are unreasonable, then I got a pretty big list that I could give you anytime you want. I'm talking about stuff that is so profound that no human could have thought of it. Without such an example, all you've essentially said here is that, yeah, the book has problems. You just personally think that it's got good stuff that makes up for those problems. What is that good stuff? Oh, you wouldn't know it. It lives in Canada.
When we do this, we don't get caught up in fighting whether if it was 12 or 15 of something, red or green, spelled correctly or perfectly historically accurate, as humans get these things wrong from time to time.
Well, the things I brought up were aspects of the character of God, which is the kind of thing you wouldn't expect humans to get wrong in a book whose writing is supposedly guided by that God.
What matters then is the underlying truth, something found between the lines and at a bird's eye view.
To rephrase, why would you expect a book whose writing was guided by an all-powerful perfect being to be perfect? Just ignore the imperfections and read perfection into it by looking for stuff that isn't actually there.
My biggest problem with Christianity is the Christians. Hypocrites that spread hatred.
It's not just the hypocrisy that's the problem, it's the institutional hypocrisy. If one priest turns out to be bad, that's just one priest. In any large enough group of human beings, you're gonna find some bad ones. But when the church goes out of its way to protect and enable the bad people, all while expecting the flock of lay people to live up to an impossibly high standard, that becomes an issue that, at best, speaks very poorly of the character of God. If I start with the assumption that the Catholic God exists, then that means that he's comfortable allowing such an obviously corrupt organization to be his spokesperson here on Earth, which speaks to this God being the kind of God that I would never be able to love or worship. But realistically, it speaks more to the Catholic God just not existing in the first place. Such a God would be able to prevent hypocrisy from rising to the institutional level.
Well, you're not going to find a lot of disagreement from me. Over the years, Christians have been a part of a number of horrible atrocities, both individually and institutionally, and there are plenty of everyday Christians today who are just bad people.
Did you notice how he shifted the focus away from the institution while at the same time acknowledging the institutional problem? He talked about institutional problems having happened over the years, in a way that leaves the door open for it to still be happening today, but while heavily implying that it's a thing of the past, an implication that is reinforced by the next statement being explicitly about today, and explicitly about individuals. It was an institutional problem over the years, but today it's bad individuals behaving badly. But if you do a search for Catholic sex scandal, you'll find a bunch of news stories of priests charged with sex abuse, the church fighting against investigation into sex abuse, the church fighting against mandatory reporting laws, groups begging the Pope to take some kind of responsibility for all the church's actions, and more, all from this year. Now, sure, a lot of it is historical stuff with people who were abused decades ago coming forward, but the church is still actively fighting against having to be accountable for what they have done in any way whatsoever. Like, seriously, most of the investigations that happened in the various states over the last few years boiled down to investigators walking into the church and being like, hey, do you have a list of people who are credibly accused of sexual assault? With them replying with, yes, here you go, it's a really long one. The fact that they don't turn these lists over to law enforcement until after they are asked for them speaks volumes. They know that there is a problem, they know the extent of it, but they're happy to hide it for as long as they can. Also, side note, a lot of times the lists that they hand over just happen to have stopped accumulating names around the time the statutes of limitations for the various crimes come into effect, so that's not suspicious at all. This isn't individual bad people making bad choices. This is an institution that is rotten to its core. and its core is supposed to be an all-powerful, all-loving God. So the natural conclusion here is that their God does not exist.
But surely we can't believe that the people who do these things or act in this way are really disciples of Jesus, can we?
Ah, yes, the good old no true Scotsman argument. By the same metric that you're dismissing such people, saying they aren't truly Christian, I can now dismiss the Catholic Church as not being the true representation of God because it takes these bad people's traits and institutionalizes them.
The problem we see isn't with Christians, it's with people claiming to be Christians that know nothing of Christ.
So, bunch of priests that made it through all the Catholic training required to become a priest somehow got through that training while knowing nothing of Christ? It's a weird stance to take, but go on.
For me, I think it's much better to judge us based on what we do when we're actually following the teachings of Jesus.
And I think it's best to judge people based on their actions, regardless of which religious figure they claim to be following.
What we see are people who found hospitals and schools, give to the poor, show humility, and welcome strangers.
Well, regarding the hospitals, it's actually a massive problem in the United States that Catholic-run hospitals have policies about which medical procedures they will or will not perform, based not on the latest medical research and consensus, but on what Catholic bishops with no medical training say is permissible. Having a baby via C-section and figure that while the doctor's in there, may as well get a tubal ligation as well, since that's literally the best time to do that? Not if you're in a Catholic hospital. Have an ectopic pregnancy that could literally kill you if you don't take care of it with some very safe and effective medication? Well, you can't do that at a Catholic hospital. Instead, because of a bunch of technical loopholes, they're allowed to remove the fallopian tube entirely that the embryo implanted in, which is a completely unnecessary procedure that has a much higher risk of complications, as well as a detrimental impact on the patient's ability to get pregnant in the future. Are you in the process of miscarrying a fetus? Catholic hospitals can't do anything about that until you have an active infection. And as far as serving the poor, Catholic hospitals serve a lower percentage of Medicaid-insured patients than other hospitals and provide less outright charity care. As for giving to the poor, see that aforementioned thing about the Catholic Church having tens of billions of dollars in assets, most of which could easily be better used to give to the poor. Also, the aforementioned thing about Catholic hospitals doing less work for the poor than non-Catholic hospitals. As for showing humility, the Catholic Church is world-renowned for their ostentatious displays with unnecessarily large cathedrals featuring extravagant art, the museums dedicated to displaying all the collectibles they've collected over the years, the fancy hats, etc. Now, don't get me wrong, I love me an impressive cathedral and some beautiful artwork, but you can't be an organization that builds those things and commissions that art and simultaneously claims to be humble. And the schools? Need I go into the schools? As with sex abuse scandals, everywhere that Catholic-run schools have been looked into, they have been found to be replete with things like abuse, neglect, and cultural genocide. So when looking at the criteria that you just gave of what makes someone a true Christian, the Catholic Church, at best, superficially meets some of them, and the secular alternatives do a much better job of it than the Catholic ones.
It just seems to me that gods were an invention of ancient people to explain things they didn't understand. We know how the world works now. Why keep this silly belief?
Well, we don't know everything about how the world works, but yeah, I'd say that we know enough to say that a god is not required.
While I understand where this question comes from, I think it's a bit condescending to our ancestors. Sure, we've made huge strides in science and technology, but do we really think that we have continued to progress in every area of knowledge?
Yes? Is there an area of knowledge you think we haven't progressed in? Okay, probably. You probably think that we have, if anything, regressed in our religious knowledge, but I'd argue that religious knowledge doesn't actually count as knowledge. I mean, really, I could get into the weeds philosophically and talk about what even counts as knowledge in the first place. And there are some definitions by which religious knowledge would count as knowledge, even if that knowledge is untrue. But for the purposes of this video, I will be using knowledge to mean epistemic certainty. I'll leave a link to one of Apologia's videos going more in-depth on this topic, as well as touching on some of the other types of knowledge. But for the basics, epistemic certainty refers to beliefs that you have that conform to reality. Things that you believe to be true, which are actually true. Justified true beliefs, to put it another way. So in the realm of epistemic certainty, I would suggest that religious knowledge does not actually count as knowledge. As a species, our justified true beliefs have expanded greatly throughout the centuries, and there isn't really any area where we look at history and think, oh man, those ancient people knew so much more than we do. So when it comes to knowledge in the epistemic certainty sense, yes, we know more than the people of ancient history.
I'm not so sure that our art is as good as it's ever been.
That's not knowledge, that's subjective preference. It also depends very much on what you mean by art. YouTube has recently decided that I want to watch videos of woodworkers making extravagant and intricate furniture. With modern techniques and tools, they can make much more interesting furniture than was possible, much faster than was possible in the past. The incorporation of epoxy into woodworking allowed for imperfections in the wood to be corrected in ways that could express the woodworker's individual style. Everything from over-the-top epoxy river tables to just using it to fill in knots and cracks using colors that either blend in with the wood or serve to accentuate it. We've been bending wood planks for about 1200 years now, with the Vikings being the first society known to be successful at it, but again, modern technology has made it much easier for woodworkers to come up with all sorts of designs that would have been essentially impossible in the past. To move on to another art form, photography was literally impossible until the photograph was invented, and modern photographers are quite a bit better at it than the ones working in the early 20th century. Photorealism in paintings and drawings didn't exist until the 1960s, and that takes quite a bit of talent. Pick any art form, and I can pretty much guarantee that there are artists working with it today that are producing work that rivals that of previous generations of artists, potentially even surpassing them. But again, this is subjective. Photorealism is great and takes a lot of talent, but maybe I want a Renaissance painting. Well, there are still artists today who work with that style, and they are just as good as the photorealists at what they do, but it's for a different audience.
Our poetry.
Well, personally, I would have categorized poetry with art, but sure, poets still exist, and many of them are probably quite good. Same as with other forms of art.
Our family structures.
Our family structures are now more inclusive and don't ostracize people for sometimes being in unavoidable situations. Are you really suggesting that the world was a better place when a single mother would be ostracized for committing the crime of having a kid out of wedlock? Was it better when women were forced to remain in abusive marriages because of not only the social stigma of becoming a divorcee, but also because it was financially impossible to leave even if she did have a job because she couldn't have a bank account or a credit card? Is denying children access to a loving household because you disapprove of LGBTQ people, thus leaving more children in institutions that are constantly overburdened, resulting in worse outcomes for the children, a good thing? No, the modern acceptance of a diversity of family structures is way better than the strictly enforced heteronormativity of the past.
Relationship with the natural world.
Not really. Humans and their evolutionary precursors have been causing other animals to go extinct for at least 4 million years. An increase in the extinction rate correlates with an increase in the hominid brain size, and modern humans caused the extinction of megafauna everywhere they went. The reason we think of past cultures as living more in harmony with nature is not because they had some deep-rooted knowledge about the importance of nature that we lack, it's because they didn't have the capability of doing the same amounts of damage as we do. And of course, there were cultural variations here. Not all cultures were equally bad or good for the environment, but on the whole, humans are bad for the environment. We don't have less of an appreciation for nature than our ancestors, but because they didn't have the technology to be able to pave over nature at the same rate as we do, they get romanticized. And this happens specifically because we do appreciate nature.
Sense of morality.
So today's world, where most of us agree that slavery is bad and that women are people too, is one where you think our sense of morality has regressed? You want to go back to the pre-civil rights days, morally speaking? Thanks, but no thanks.
Awe and wonder.
How do you regress in a sense of awe and wonder? Okay, really everything that he's listed here is opinion-based at best. I think old art is prettier. I liked it better when a white guy like me could oppress minorities like women, people of color, and LGBTQ people, etc. I fail to see how we have decreased our knowledge in these areas.
There are things that our forebears knew and understand that, frankly, we've lost touch with.
Yeah, you know what? I will never be able to make a spear the way that my great-great-great-great-great times a few hundred more great-grandfather could. But if I really wanted to, I could pay someone to make me one that would be objectively better than his spear in every way, using modern technology, techniques, and materials.
And plenty of things in our world that science and technology will never be able to fully explain.
Not being able to fully explain something does not mean that you can't still increase your level of understanding of that thing. At best, this gets us to a God of the Gaps argument.
Isn't it possible that people before us knew something that we didn't?
Keep in mind that this is all in the context of ancient people creating gods as explanations for things that we observe in reality. Father Casey is a Christian. He believes in a God that wants everyone to have a personal relationship with him. But according to his argument here, ancient humans had more direct access to God, and thus could experience that in a way that we cannot. Kinda makes God a dick, does it not?
How can you believe in God without any evidence? For most agnostic people, this is the biggest hang-up with religion.
With the general concept of religion, maybe, but when we start talking about specifics, then I can provide you with the evidence that points to the conclusion that your specific God does not exist. I did that in a previous video with the Christian God, but I imagine that Casey wouldn't agree with most of that one, as I tackled it from a Protestant and somewhat literalistic standpoint, but the point remains. Give me a specific enough description of your God, and one of three things will happen. Either I will be able to tell you why I believe that God does not exist, I won't be able to tell you exactly why, but I remain unconvinced of his existence, or I will believe in your God. And while I'm not as familiar with the Catholic God as I am with the Protestant God, I know enough about him to be able to say that the most likely option here is that I will be able to tell you why I don't believe in him.
There's no empirical proof, and that's correct. But there is more to truth than what we can see and can measure.
Well, since I went to Apologia's video for my definition of knowledge, I may as well steal his definition of truth as well. Truth is the extent to which a proposition corresponds to reality as adjudicated by predictive power. So basically, a statement is true when it perfectly matches reality. Statements can be more or less true depending on how well they match reality, and the way we determine the truth value of a statement is with predictive power. Make a statement, figure out what will happen if the statement is true as opposed to when it's false, and then see what actually happens. The chair is at my desk is a statement. If it is a true statement, then I can expect that when I sit down at my desk, I will end up in the chair rather than on the floor. So when I go to sit down, if I end up in the chair, then I have now determined that the statement matched reality and can be treated as true. If I fall on the floor, then I have now determined that the statement did not match reality and can be treated as false. So honestly, I don't know how you could define truth in a way where it would still be truth, but doesn't have to match up with reality. Unless it's the as adjudicated by predictive power part that you disagree with. But in that case, you need to provide an alternative adjudicator, and one that can actually be demonstrated to be reliable.
Beauty, goodness, love, inspiration.
Okay, you listing a bunch of purely subjective things doesn't help here.
These things can't be quantified or proven beyond a doubt, and even if we could pinpoint the neurons and brain chemistry that help us experience these things, do you really think that they would be sufficient to explain what they mean to us?
At this point, you're just describing the difference between knowing how something feels and experiencing that feeling for yourself. But since it's our experiences you're talking about, it's kind of irrelevant, as we do have those. Now, obviously this is headed towards an argument for God based on personal experience. Science can't tell me that my experience with God wasn't real. And yeah, I kind of agree with that. But what science can do is figure out that these experiences have their basis in neurology and work the same way regardless of which religion is providing the experience. In addition to that, psychedelic drugs such as psilocybin and DMT have very similar impact on brain activity as activities like meditation and group worship. Side note, while reading about this, I learned about the Good Friday experiment from the 1960s, where people attending a church service were given either psilocybin or, for the control group, niacin. And the people that got the psilocybin had much more intense spiritual experiences than the control group, with effects that lasted for decades in some cases. So it's interesting to me that Christian groups are often so opposed to recreational drugs when they could be used to, make stronger Christians. Anyway, group worship and meditation have similar impact on the brain as psychedelics, and this impact does not change depending on which religion is being studied. To me, this suggests that the experiences that we call spiritual and religious are entirely based in brain chemistry, just like all our other experiences and emotions appear to be. You can say that it actually connects us with a higher power or a divine being of some kind, if you like, but scientifically speaking, the existence of this higher power or divine being is irrelevant. The brain chemistry works the same way, whether the thing you think you're interacting with is real or not. And at the very least, the fact that the effects are the same regardless of the religion being studied suggests that if there really is a higher power or divine being, it doesn't care which religion you are. Which kind of suggests that, if such a being is out there, it's not the Christian God, because that guy definitely does care about what religion you are. Seems like it'd be a touch counterproductive for him to provide those same experiences to people he would later throw into a lake of fire for committing the crime of having had religious experiences that conform to a religion other than Christianity for them.
For me, at least, there is a mystery to the universe, a wonder beyond words that proof cannot capture.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but what you seem to have said there is, it's really neat that there's stuff I don't know, and you can't prove it. Which is quite strange. I guess I just don't know what's going on in your head. Neat. You can't prove it.
Why doesn't God reveal himself to everyone?
Excellent question. If he actually wanted everyone to believe in him, popping in to say hi would literally be the least he could do.
Yes, this is the follow-up question to that. At least there could be some proof, you say. Why couldn't God pop out of the sky every so often and say something? Wouldn't that make things a lot easier?
It's not about being easier, it's about being reasonable. It's not reasonable for God to condemn people to hell for not believing in him without sufficient evidence. I'd argue that even with sufficient evidence, hell is still unreasonable, but putting that aside, the very least he could do if he actually wants us to believe in and worship him is to demonstrate his existence in an undeniable way.
I think there are three things to say here. One, he did. At least according to the witnesses of Scripture, to the stories of people who had visions, to the example of Jesus himself. God did just that, and people refused to believe in miracles.
Okay, so normally the counter to the idea that he should undeniably prove his existence to everyone is either to go the Romans 1:18-20 route of saying everyone does already believe in God, some people just suppress that truth so that they can sin, or they'll say that God proving himself in such a way would effectively remove our free will from us. Father Casey has thrown both of those out now by pointing out that the people who were alive with Jesus had such evidence and some didn't believe anyway. Which then leaves us wondering, it doesn't violate free will, and not everyone just inherently believes in God, so worst case scenario is that if God undeniably demonstrated his existence to everyone, Christianity would massively grow, but it would still not be ubiquitous. More souls would be saved, and you wouldn't have the issue of a God throwing people into hell for not believing in a thing for which there is insufficient evidence, but for some reason he still doesn't do that?
Doubters will always find reasons to doubt.
Which doesn't excuse God from providing evidence to everyone anyway. Surely not every single person who is a non-Christian today would remain non-Christian in the face of actual undeniable evidence, right? Like, yeah, there would be some who probably would, but there would be a lot who wouldn't. And even if it wouldn't change the religious demographics at all, at the very least it would give people like me less ammunition to use against Christianity.
Number two, when would it stop? Would Jesus have to be born, die, and rise again in every age to every people for us to believe?
No, God could just do that thing that he did all the time in the Old Testament, where he actually just shows up and talks to people. But hey, let's pretend that the only way for God to actually demonstrate his existence is through showing up as Jesus in every generation. The dude is omnipotent. For him, that would be super easy, barely an inconvenience.
Super easy, barely an inconvenience.
If more souls could be saved from being thrown into hell by having Jesus be born in every generation, then would God doing that for every generation not be a reasonable expectation? I mean, assuming he actually wants people to be saved like Christians claim he does? You're treating God as a neglectful father here who doesn't spend any time with his kids and gets annoyed at being interrupted anytime they pop in to ask him to spend time with them. No, guys, come on, go away. Don't you know I'm busy? Come on, make your own dinner and just leave me alone. Come on. Editor, cut that. More to the point though, do you really think that your omniscient God is so uncreative that the only way he could possibly think to prove his existence to people is through showing up as a human that can do magic tricks? I feel like there are way better ways for him to accomplish that.
It seems pretty impractical to say the least.
Why would it be impractical for an omnipotent being to repeat a thing that he's already done? He's omnipotent! For it to be impractical would mean that his abilities are limited. Alternatively, impractical could mean that there's a better way to do it, which then plays into my earlier comment about the lack of creativity that this answer is displaying. Obviously, sending a human who can do magic tricks that, in this day and age, are actually rather unimpressive wouldn't do much in the way of increasing the number of Christians, so it'd probably be more productive for God the Father to do some of that God the Father shit that he did in the Old Testament when he talked directly to people. And yeah, as a limited human, it does seem impractical to spend time talking to every human being on an individual level, but God isn't supposed to be a limited human. He's supposed to be omnipresent, so he's already in the room with everyone, and being omnipotent, he has the power to strike up a conversation with everyone that he's already in the room with. Like, right now, according to Christianity, he's in the room with me, watching me record this, and has the ability to just pop in and say hi. He can hear me arguing that his failure to do so will result in more people being sent to hell, a result that his followers claim he does not want. So he could just make himself visible right now and explain why I'm wrong. And I promise that if he does, I'll keep it in the video. But I am confident that he will not, because he behaves in exactly the same way as we would expect if he did not exist.
And 3, where would that leave faith?
You ask that as though it's obvious to everyone that a willingness to believe things with insufficient evidence is obviously a good thing. I'd rather believe on evidence than on faith, thank you very much.
If God were someone who could just be measured and tested, then we would be left with no choice but to believe.
Except you yourself pointed out earlier that some people didn't believe in Jesus, despite Jesus being alive counting as irrefutable evidence for God in your construction of the argument. But also, belief does not automatically entail worship or love. Plenty of atheists are happy to tell you that even if they came to believe in the Christian God at some point, they'd never be able to worship him because the God that is described by the Bible is a genocidal, narcissistic, petty, and cruel God. Now, I'm not sure I'd be able to put myself in that camp. I'd like to say that I'd remain completely intellectually honest and maintain my vocal opposition to this God, but I don't actually know that I'd be able to do that with the threat of hell looming over my head. Which is a whole other can of fucked up worms. Apologists like to claim that God wants everyone to freely choose to love him. But if you actually believe he exists, then your choice cannot be free, as a choice to not love him is punished with eternal torture. And yes, I am aware that Catholics define hell as an eternal separation from God that is voluntarily chosen, but they also don't shy away from the fiery descriptions of it that Jesus gave, so apparently this separation does amount to torture. They pretend it's self-inflicted by people who choose to not accept Jesus, but if we don't have sufficient evidence to convince us that God exists and that Jesus was his human incarnation on Earth, can failing to believe that really be considered a voluntary choice? And even if I did have sufficient evidence, can my inability to love someone who I view as torturing people for not liking him really be said to be a choice on my part? I don't think so.
Gravity exists whether we believe it or not.
Good example, because that is a true statement, and yet there are flat earthers who do not believe that gravity exists. Its effects are undeniable, yet people still deny them. Irrefutable evidence of the existence of gravity exists, and there are still people who do not believe. Ergo, providing irrefutable evidence of something does not automatically result in a 100% saturation of belief in that thing in the population.
This is not how faith works, and there is something critically important about having to trust and to take a leap of faith.
Why, though? You can't just say that as though it's an obviously true statement and expect me to believe it. Well, I mean, I guess you could do that. You might even see that as a good thing, because that would be me taking it on faith, but I don't see how being overly credulous is a virtue.
You do know that there's no evidence that Jesus even existed, right?
No, there is evidence of his existence. A proper mythicist will explain why that evidence is insufficient to establish the historicity of Jesus, but there is no denying that it exists. Personally, I'm of the non-mythicist variety. I don't think the evidence for Jesus' historicity is particularly strong, but I also think that the existence of Christianity as a religion is easier to explain in light of his actual existence than not, as all that would be required for Christianity to be based on his existence is for a first-century apocalyptic Jewish preacher, of which there were many, with a very common name, to have existed, gained a following, and been executed in one of the most common execution methods that the Romans used. None of that is particularly extraordinary, and when you add in Paul having actually met with a handful of the disciples of Jesus, it seems to me like Occam's razor would have us discard the idea that the man at the center of the religion did not exist at all.
Technically, this is true.
Oh, well, fuck me for having a nuanced opinion, I guess.
Not only is there no video, photographic, or DNA evidence of a man named Jesus in the first century, there's no archaeological record Christians can point to as undeniable proof.
You know that's not the only kind of evidence that could establish someone's existence as an historical figure, right? Like, Tacitus, for instance, undoubtedly existed, but there's no video, photographic, DNA, or archaeological evidence related to him. And hell, we don't even know what his first name was, whether he had children, where he was born, who his family was, etc. But he wrote a bunch of shit that survived. We don't have the original, so hypothetically you could propose that someone or a group of someones in a later time wrote in his name, pretending to be him, including his correspondence with Pliny the Younger, but we have no reason to think that this is the case. Admittedly, this isn't a perfect comparison with Jesus, since Jesus didn't write anything himself, and we have 0 eyewitness accounts from anyone who actually knew him, but that doesn't mean that there is a complete dearth of evidence, though I will admit that I feel very strange about being placed in the position where I am defending the historicity of Jesus against a Christian.
But then again, neither is there any such evidence for someone like Genghis Khan or most people in the ancient world.
That's not true at all. There has been extensive archaeological research into the Mongol Empire, to such an extent that researchers have actually pointed out that there's a comparative lack of research into the archaeology of the Mongolian homeland during the period of the Mongolian Empire. We have records of politicians interacting with Khan. We have detailed accounts of his life written within a generation of his death. We have accounts from other areas documenting the sudden political shift and the atrocities committed by the Mongols during their conquest. To equate the level of evidence for Genghis Khan's existence with that for Jesus' existence is just completely disingenuous.
What we have are first-hand witness accounts, stories, and a world clearly turned upside down by his presence, but no proof. Are you doubting Genghis Khan's existence too?
Yeah, okay, so Father Casey just doesn't understand how the study of history works. Great.
We know that Jesus existed because of multiple attestations in the various writings of Scripture, the accounts of the Roman historian Josephus, and the fact that literally thousands of people claimed to be Christians by the middle of the 1st century.
The biblical attestation is the main line of evidence, and it's honestly not great. Paul mostly talks about Jesus in a spiritual sense, and the Gospels were non-eyewitness accounts written decades later as polemics meant to convince people of Christianity. Within the Bible, probably the strongest evidence for Jesus actually being a real guy is Paul meeting with some of his disciples. There are other hints of historicity scattered throughout the New Testament, things like the fact that both the authors of Matthew and Luke felt the need to explain how Jesus could have been from Nazareth when the Messianic prophecy said the Messiah would be from Bethlehem, with both accounts creating a mythical narrative that accomplished that in a different way, or the story in Mark about how Jesus couldn't perform in his hometown, seemingly in an attempt to explain why the people who knew him best did not believe that he was the Messiah. Paul's mention of Jesus' brother also comes to mind. But the extra-biblical stuff is usually quite underwhelming. The Testimonium Flavianum was subject to Christian interpolation, the extent of which is impossible to fully determine. Josephus also mentioned Jesus' brother James, which, despite being the less flashy line of evidence, is the stronger of the two. Tacitus is the other extra-biblical mention that gets the most attention, and what it boils down to is, there's a religion called Christianity, and this is a thing that they believe. Now, it is possible with the way it was worded that Tacitus actually was aware of Jesus' crucifixion, as he says very certainly that Jesus suffered the extreme penalty under Pontius Pilate. That part isn't couched as a belief of the Christians, but rather as the event that began the religion. But he doesn't indicate that he actually checked up on it. That idea is based on the assumption that he had the ability to do that. Ultimately, we don't know for sure. It could just be that he was treating the claim the same way I do. The Christians say Jesus was crucified. That's the thing we do to people all the time, so sure, why not? As to how quickly Christianity spread, that's irrelevant. The speed at which an idea spreads throughout a population says nothing about the truth of that idea. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people right now, who within the last month came to believe that the immigrants in Springfield, Ohio are stealing and eating people's pets.
We're the sauce on your stack, we're the cheese in your cake. We put the spring in Springfield.
They're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the pets in Springfield.
And what's more, apologists will often speak of things like the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15 as being a call for people to fact-check with the witnesses who saw Jesus. But as we see from the Springfield story, even video footage of the guy who began spreading it saying outright that he made it up in order to get media attention isn't enough to convince people that it's not true. So it is hypothetically possible that 100% of Jesus' disciples, if anyone asked them, would say that Jesus died and stayed dead, and for Christianity to still have grown in the way that it did anyway. Now, personally, I agree with the minimal witnesses hypothesis. That proposes at least a couple of the disciples really did come to believe in a risen Jesus. My point in saying that is merely to point out that the ability to fact-check something does not mean that the people will actually engage in the fact-checking, or that those who do engage in it will accept the results. And that behavior is on full display in American politics right now.
Why Christianity over other religions?
Mostly because people tend to wind up being the same religion as their parents. Another thing that you wouldn't expect to be the case if there really was a God who cared what religion you were.
This is as much a personal question for me as it is a theological one. Christianity is unique in its theology of the Trinity and incarnation.
Every religion is unique in one way or another. Christians just point to the things that make Christianity unique and treat those particular qualities as though they are the most important qualities to consider when deciding on a religion. But ultimately, this is an entirely arbitrary metric.
God does not simply watch from afar, neither does he procreate and form half-gods. He became part of creation while maintaining his divinity.
Why would creating demigods through procreation not maintain the parent god's divinity? Why do you ignore the personal experiences people have with non-Christian gods like Krishna when talking about God's intervention?
There is such beauty to me in the humble sacrifice and such hope in the fact that God came to be like us so that we could become like him.
And a Buddhist will say that there is such beauty in the fact that with enough practice and discipline, everyone can eventually achieve nirvana through the giving up of desire. What's your point?
Other religions obviously include divine revelation and a sense of heaven, but none as intimate as Christianity.
Who are you to judge the level of intimacy of someone else's experience? Why do you get to be the arbiter that decides on that?
How can you believe in a God who condemns a good person to hell just because they were of the wrong religion?
More to the point, how can you worship such a God? If there were enough evidence, I could believe in him, but worship would not be something I'd be keen on.
I don't. Simply put, while I believe that salvation is through Christ alone and that he established his church on earth to be a guide and gateway to heaven, I don't for a second believe that God is bound by human conventions. All religions capture some truth of God. I don't believe that they're the clearest picture, but there is no doubt that they spark inspiration and plant mystery into souls, hopefully developing virtue.
I thought earlier about mentioning the Pope's recent statements about how all religions lead to God, with a bunch of angry Catholics posting variations of, the answer to the question, is the Pope Catholic, is now no. So Father Casey sides with the Pope on this one. Okay, well, what about the people like me? I don't believe in any religion. I consider myself to be a good person. Does this salvation through other religions thing extend to atheists as well? If so, then it's better than other Christian interpretations, I guess, but if not, that's just about as bad and rather arbitrary to boot.
If a Muslim, Jew, or Buddhist comes face to face with God upon their death and says, yes, this is exactly what I was seeking in my religion, I just didn't know what I was missing, there is not a doubt in me that God will welcome them into himself.
What about the atheists, though? How come other religions get the option of posthumous conversion, but not atheists?
Why does God allow suffering?
Because he's a dick.
This is the quintessential question, right? People have asked this for thousands of years with thousands of different responses. Obviously, free will plays a big part in this, and if someone chooses bad things that have inevitable consequences, people are going to get hurt.
Yeah, but God designed a world where that is possible. And unless you think we lose our free will when we go to heaven, then it's also possible for God to create a world where free will exists without suffering. So free will cannot be an excuse to allow suffering.
But I don't think that that really gets at the heart of the question, because God could still intervene, but doesn't always.
Or ever.
And the reason, I believe, is because suffering is not always bad or without merit.
This is true. However, it's not universally true, and I'd argue that it's not even true in most cases. It's an idea that appeals to us emotionally. Wouldn't it be nice if all the bad shit that happened to me would result in something better in the long run? And because of this emotional appeal, this idea gets scattered all throughout our entertainment media. But in reality, when you can't pay your bills and have your utilities cut off, that just makes your life miserable. When my middle child had to be resuscitated and kept in the neonatal intensive care unit for several weeks, that didn't make things better for us in the long run. That was just a super stressful time that slightly increased my chance of having a heart attack later in life. What doesn't kill you doesn't actually make you stronger. Usually it makes it slightly more likely that something related to that will finish the job later. If you survive a heart attack, you don't then get to increase how much bacon and junk food you eat because your heart is stronger now. You actually have to do the opposite because your heart is weaker now. Honestly, to claim that all suffering leads to something better is to admit that your privileged ass doesn't actually know what real suffering is. It's essentially, well, it all worked out for me, so this must be a universal truth. And it's not even biblically supported. Jesus says that more people will go to hell than heaven, and in hell there continues to be suffering. So in the grand scheme of things, most people suffering here on earth will not lead to something better later, but will lead to being in a permanent state of suffering after death, according to Christianity at least.
We willingly suffer at the gym and go on diets. Women freely go through labor and raise children.
Going on a diet or going to the gym is in no way comparable to actual suffering. And the suffering that happens during childbirth is not inherently good and does not make things better in the long run. In fact, I seem to recall a verse in the book of Genesis that points out that suffering during childbirth is actually a punishment from God for eating the fruit. But even so, the implication here is that the use of painkillers during delivery somehow makes having the baby less rewarding. That's just ridiculous.
Some people love horror movies and watch tragedies. Why?
Because feeling emotions that are normally reserved for dangerous or traumatic situations in a scenario where you are perfectly safe is actually good for your mental health. Learning that is what got me to finally watch Alien for the first time during the COVID lockdowns. I had avoided it for my whole life because I hate horror movies, and I kept hearing it described as a sci-fi horror movie. So when I learned that watching horror is good for your mental health during a time when mental health was at risk, I decided that even though I don't like horror, at least it's a sci-fi horror, so I'll be able to find something I like about it. And I loved it. But that is mostly irrelevant. My point here is that being scared during a movie is not suffering. And if your life has been cushy enough that you consider that to actually amount to suffering, then you've got no grounds to be explaining to us that suffering isn't really all that bad.
Because sometimes suffering purifies us, makes us stronger, gives us perspective, takes away our fear, brings immense fulfillment in surviving it, and even leads to something much greater than we ever knew.
Yeah, sometimes all that can happen, but most of the time, that does not happen.
The problem with our human lives sometimes is that we are so short-sighted. We can only see the present and only care about our immediate needs.
Well, in a lot of cases, if your immediate needs are not met, you die. So yeah, meeting immediate needs is important.
God can see the whole picture, and his ultimate goal is to draw us out of this world into the next.
To paraphrase, God's goal is to kill you slowly and painfully. Well, I guess this explains how Mother Teresa justified her actions. For those unaware, Mother Teresa was actually a very bad person who raised enough money to build a state-of-the-art hospital, but just funneled the majority of it back to the Vatican to disappear into their shady ledgers, and running her hospices in a way that maximized the suffering of the people in her care. She believed what Father Casey has just said about how suffering can purify you and bring you closer to Jesus. So she saw it as her mandate to help the people in her care become purified and brought closer to Jesus.
Sometimes a touch of suffering here is exactly what we need for eternity.
Well, for a lot of people, it's more than just a touch. And according to Jesus, that is not what is needed for the vast majority of people, so fuck off with that noise.
I just can't accept an organization that is homophobic.
Yep, that's fair.
Homophobia is a sin. To fear or to hate something or someone is not the plan that God has for anyone. And so if religion is truly homophobic, systematically seeking to cause harm in another, this is a problem.
I'm glad you admit that, but you are also part of a religion that systematically tries to deny LGBTQ people equal rights, something that causes them harm. So, practice what you preach?
That said, there is nothing inherently homophobic about Christianity in general or the Catholic Church in particular.
From the Catechism of the Catholic Church, Part 3, Section 2, Chapter 2, Subsection 3, and no, I have no idea if that's the proper citation format for this document, quote, "Basing itself on sacred scripture which presents homosexual acts as acts of grave depravity, tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. They are contrary to the natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine affective and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved." In fairness, it does go on to say that people with homosexual tendencies, as they refer to them, should be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity, but calling them gravely depraved, intrinsically disordered, and contrary to the natural law, among others, doesn't seem very respectful, compassionate, or sensitive. I know they're trying to go the love the sinner, hate the sin route, but just imagine the scenario being flipped. Pretend for a moment that we lived in a culture where homosexuality has become legally mandated. You're either gay, or you're not allowed to have a legally recognized relationship. What about those who were already in heterosexual marriages before this happened? Well, it sucks to be them, I guess. They just need to get divorced, and their families must be split up. I've seen Christians calling for this with gay couples even after they've been married, but they don't seem to be able to empathize with just how shitty an attitude this is. Either that or their relationships actually suck, and so they don't see how anyone could have a good relationship, so forcing people to divorce doesn't really seem all that bad to them. Either way, it's not a good look. Anyway, my point here is that this section of the official Catholic Church doctrine talking about homosexuality is explicitly homophobic. Tacking on a "but be nice about it though" clause at the end doesn't negate the heinous shit that they say about homosexual people in the rest of the section.
For Catholics, at least, there are two inherent purposes to all sexual activity: procreation and union.
The vast majority of sexual activity, even among Catholics who do not use contraception, does not result in procreation, so the idea that that's the primary purpose for sex is just laughable. It's mostly about what he probably means by union, bonding with your partner. But it can also just be for fun. It can be for stress relief. Hell, it can even just be to kill some time while you're bored. And that is all assuming sex with a partner. Masturbation has a similar range of benefits and zero chance of procreation.
Any action that denies either of these possibilities falls short of God's plan and reduces sex to merely an act of pleasure.
If God didn't want sex to be a pleasurable act, he could have not made it that way. Treating pleasure as inherently bad is problematic to say the least. Instill the idea that pleasure is bad in people starting when they're children, and you wind up with adults suffering from Catholic guilt complexes, psychologically damaged to a point where things that should be pleasurable just aren't. And on the flip side, making pleasure a forbidden fruit can make it all the more tempting. There's a reason that the people who went through the Catholic school system have a reputation for debauchery. The guilt makes it more enticing.
This, for us, is immoral, and we must call people to something higher, but our true faith neither condemns people nor looks down on someone for their thoughts or attractions.
I feel like the guy who said that having lustful thoughts is the same as adultery and being angry is the same as murder might disagree with that statement. You know, Jesus, that guy?
I feel like Jesus was just a good guy. His disciples made up the resurrection to keep the word going.
Disagree. Jesus was not a good guy. He was a mediocre guy at best, and said some shit that was very easy to interpret in a way that would lead to things like the 30 Years' War and the Crusades. Though that is assuming that the words attributed to him in the Bible were actually his. Many of them almost certainly were not, which makes figuring out what he really said difficult at best, which doesn't seem like something that would happen to the lessons that an all-powerful God had to impart to humanity.
Interestingly enough, this was actually a concept explored in the Martin Scorsese film The Last Temptation of Christ.
I don't actually care. Skip!
But I don't think that Christianity would have had any lasting success without people actually seeing him risen from the dead.
And I don't think Mormonism would have had any lasting success without the witnesses actually seeing the golden plates that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon from. See how that's not actually a very good metric?
Remember, the Gospels themselves paint the first disciples as pretty incompetent.
Yeah, that's the audience insert literary device. It gives Jesus a reason to explain what he means in a way that doesn't break the narrative. It's the purpose that Watson serves in the Sherlock Holmes book, the companions in Doctor Who, Bilbo in The Hobbit. The books, of course. The movies are too much of a mess for me to even want to begin commenting on.
I could have anything down my trousers.
Or nothing.
I don't think they had it in them.
So, you think they didn't have it in them to make shit up because they were idiots? Sure, why not?
And lastly, I tried praying, but didn't hear anything.
More to the point, for me at least, is that I tried praying while I was losing my faith after living faithfully as a Christian for most of my life, and didn't hear anything. I didn't have problems with prayer before I started having doubts, so it seems like God can only answer people who already fully believe in him. Which kinda sucks for those who are experiencing doubts, and as a result of God's silence, will wind up in hell.
Well, join the club. I say this not to dismiss your comment, but to calm you. This is the way that God works.
God works by behaving exactly the way that a non-existent God would. Got it.
The Bible often notes that God speaks through whispers. The mystics claim that God's language is silence. Even some of the most zealous of saints admit that they went through periods of struggle, unsure of God's presence.
Bunch of atheists went through that struggle as well. It's what made them atheists in a lot of cases.
For me, this is not proof that God doesn't exist, but rather a tactic of God to slow us down and to draw us closer.
So, he doesn't speak audibly, but if you train yourself through years of practice, you'll learn to interpret some of your own thoughts as the thoughts of God. Got it. Again, this is the way we would expect prayer to work if God didn't exist, so as an atheist, I'm not surprised that prayer works this way.
We must train not our ears, but our minds and our hearts. It takes practice, dedication, patience, and a lot of faith to hear God when he speaks, but he does. He may not be as clear as a phone call, and you may doubt that you heard anything at all, but I can assure you that I have felt the burning within my heart, drawing my mind into unimaginable mystery. For those who have yet to experience this, it may sound like utter nonsense, and I get it. But if you've made it this far into this video, there must be something speaking to you deep down.
Money, 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 money! Money! Joking aside, yeah, this is how I make my living, but I watch these videos not just to respond to them, not just to dunk on them, but to actually learn. I get excited when I hear an apologist make an argument that I haven't heard before, and the responses I give on those rare occasions are usually a relatively unfiltered documenting of my thought process when I hear it. I'll even sometimes make mistakes in my logic or get some detail or other wrong, and not correct it before recording, instead responding to myself as I go, so you can actually see my thought pattern. And honestly, there's actually a part of me that wants to sincerely become convinced, because there's a lot of money and a lot less to pay in taxes on the Christian side of things. But I can't live a lie, so here I am with my fake Ray comfort money with the Christian tract on the back instead of the Rolexes that the megachurch pastors brag about.
My second house cost $81,900, and this watch costs more than that.
That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Mau, who says, I request more of the part of you that broke your mic with soy milk in your videos. More taping the mic in frame. Embrace the strange. Your sense of humor is great. Thanks for appreciating those bits, but unfortunately they aren't exactly planned out. It's usually a last minute, oh hey, I have a stupid idea that I think is kind of funny, and those ideas don't strike quite as frequently as I might want. Like, the soy milk thing almost didn't happen because apparently soy milk is actually quite hard to find where I am. I went to 3 separate grocery stores before I found it, and when I found it, it wasn't white soy milk, it was chocolate. I get that I could have used almond milk or just regular milk and pretended it was soy, but I feel like that would have been less authentic. I am an artist after all. One of the greats, like Michelangelo and Da Vinci before me. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Sirs every Wednesday, 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the personal appearance of God that convinces the atheist that is my channel not to be an atheist. If you'd like to do more than the Christian God can handle, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! Or by supporting the I've said this a million times. Why tongue? Make the words!